"Mom, he opened his eyes," boy shouts at elderly man's funeral who was about to be buried. A heavy silence filled the small chapel in the town of Riverside Falls, nestled in rural Pennsylvania. Friends, family, and former students paid their final respects to Professor William Harrison, a beloved figure who had dedicated over 40 years to teaching at the only town school in the area. That's when a child's shrill cry cut through the air like a knife. "Mom, he opened his eyes," exclaimed Matthew, a curly-haired boy with expressive eyes who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Time seemed to freeze as all heads turned toward the boy who was frantically pointing at the open casket where the white-haired elderly man lay. "Matthew, for heaven's sake, what are you doing?" whispered Rebecca, gripping her son's arm firmly. The young nurse's face burned with shame as dozens of eyes turned their way. "But Mom, it's true, I saw it. Professor William opened his eyes," the boy insisted, trying to wriggle free from his mother's tight hold. An uneasy murmur spread through the chapel. Mrs. Helen, the professor's widow, brought trembling hands to her chest, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. Richard, the deceased's eldest son, rose from his seat in the front row. "Please remove this child from here," he demanded, his voice choked with emotion and frustration. "This is unacceptable disrespect." The funeral, which had been proceeding with the expected solemnity, quickly turned into a scene of embarrassment. The funeral director, Mr. Mitchell, stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. "It's just a misunderstanding," he explained, adjusting his tie. "Sometimes minor muscle spasms can occur after passing. They're natural bodily reactions, nothing more." But Matthew wasn't convinced. His dark eyes remained fixed on the casket, as if trying to prove what he'd seen. Rebecca, mortified, pulled her son out of the chapel, ignoring his protests. "Mom, why doesn't anyone believe me?" Matthew asked in the parking lot, tears streaming down his round face. "I'm not lying." He opened his eyes and looked right at me. Rebecca knelt to his level, holding his shoulders firmly. "Matthew, you have to understand. Professor William is gone. I know it's hard to accept, but that's the truth. What you saw was just your imagination, or maybe a trick of the light." The boy shook his head vehemently. "It wasn't my imagination. I know what I saw." The drive home was tense and silent. Rebecca, a single mother since her husband left during her pregnancy, worked as a nurse at the only hospital in town. Sometimes, when she couldn't find someone to watch Matthew, she took him to work with her. The quiet, introspective boy spent hours drawing or reading in a corner of the staff room. Little did she know that during those times, Matthew had formed a special bond with Professor William, who had been hospitalized for several weeks before his supposed passing. When they arrived home, a small two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, Matthew ran to his room and slammed the door. Rebecca sank onto the worn-out living room couch with a deep sigh. How could she explain the mysteries of life and death to her sensitive, imaginative son? How could she make him understand that loved ones don't come back no matter how much? We wish they would. Meanwhile, at Riverside Falls Community Hospital, Dr. Claire Harrison, Professor William's granddaughter and a recent medical school graduate, anxiously reviewed her grandfather's medical records. Something didn't sit right with the final reports. Even as a new doctor, she had noticed inconsistencies that deeply troubled her. The final diagnosis listed heart failure, but some of the vital signs recorded in the last hours suggested something else. "Dr. Claire, are you done with this case yet?" asked Dr. Paul Morgan, the hospital's medical director and a close friend of Richard, Claire's uncle. "Your uncle has already come for the death certificate 3 times today." "I'm just finishing up, Dr. Paul," she replied, quickly closing the file. "Just checking some routine details." The medical director watched her for a moment before walking away. Claire knew she had to be careful. The suspicions forming in her mind were too serious to share without concrete evidence. The next morning, Matthew refused to go to school. He claimed to have a stomachache, but Rebecca knew the real reason was his fear of facing the inevitable teasing from his classmates. News of the incident at the funeral had likely already spread through the small town, where secrets rarely lasted more than a few hours. "Sweetheart, you can't skip school because of this," Rebecca insisted, trying to persuade him. "Face the situation with your head held high. You didn't do anything wrong." "Yes, I did," Matthew murmured, hugging his pillow. I should have stayed quiet. Now everyone's going to call me a liar or crazy. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand through her son's curly hair. No one's going to call you crazy. It was just a misunderstanding. It happens to everyone. It wasn't a misunderstanding, he insisted, sitting up abruptly. Mom, I need to tell you something. I knew Professor William really well. He was my friend. The revelation caught Rebecca off guard. What do you mean, Matthew? You barely knew him. You only saw him a few times at the hospital. No, Mom. I visited him whenever you were busy with patients. He taught me chess and told me stories about when he was young. He talked about how he met Mrs. Helen at a harvest festival and how he had to write her letters for months before their first date. Rebecca blinked, confused by the level of detail. Why didn't you ever tell me this? Matthew shrugged. You were always busy, and it was our secret. He said I was the grandson he wished he'd had. A pang of guilt shot through Rebecca's heart. How many other things didn't she know about? Her own son. How much time had he spent alone while she worked double shifts to support them? And yesterday at the funeral, I'm sure he recognized me. It was just for a second, but his eyes opened, and he looked at me. Right into my eyes, Mum, like he wanted to tell me something. Rebecca didn't know how to respond. The conviction in her son's voice unsettled her. Matthew had always been an honest boy, not prone to fantasies or lies. Let's do this, she offered after a moment of thought. Today you stay home and rest. Tomorrow we'll talk more about this calmly, okay? Matthew nodded, seeming a little relieved. Rebecca kissed his forehead and left for work, her heart heavy with worry. How could she help her son grieve someone who, apparently, had meant so much more to him than she'd ever realized? When she arrived at the hospital, Rebecca was immediately called into the medical director's office. Her heart raced. Was it because of the funeral incident? The town was too small for such stories not to spread quickly. Nurse Rebecca, Dr. Paul began, his face a mask of professional seriousness. I've received some complaints about your son. Rebecca felt her face grow warm. Dr. Paul, I apologize for what happened yesterday. Matthew is just a child and was confused. I promise. The doctor raised his hand, cutting her off. It's not about the funeral itself, though that was unfortunate. It's about the fact that your son apparently spent a lot of time with the patient, William Harrison, during his hospital stays. Without proper supervision, Rebecca swallowed hard. I didn't know, I knew he sometimes talked to patients, but I had no idea he'd developed such a close relationship with Professor William. I understand your challenges as a single mother, Rebecca, but the hospital has rules. Children shouldn't interact with patients without a guardian present, especially critically ill patients. Yes, doctor, it won't happen again. Dr. Paul studied her for a moment, as if weighing something. Professor William was a beloved figure in this town, a respected educator. What happened yesterday at the funeral disturbed many people, especially the family. I hope you understand the delicacy of the situation. Rebecca nodded, feeling small. After the meeting, she headed to the ward to start her shift, but was intercepted by Claire Harrison. Nurse Rebecca, can we speak privately? Surprised by the almost conspiratorial tone of the young doctor, Rebecca followed her to a small, now empty, break room. It's about your son, Matthew, Claire began, closing the door behind her, and about what he claims he saw yesterday. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Dr. Claire, I'm so sorry for the trouble. Matthew is just a confused child who apparently had a friendship with your grandfather that I knew nothing about. I promise I'm not here to complain, Claire interrupted, her intense brown eyes fixed on Rebecca. I'm here because I need to know exactly what your son saw. Rebecca blinked, confused. What do you mean? Claire hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. There are inconsistencies in my grandfather's final medical records. As a doctor, I can't ignore them, even if it means questioning decisions made by more experienced colleagues. And now, with what your son said he saw, a chill ran down Rebecca's spine. What are you suggesting, Doctor? I'm not suggesting anything yet, just gathering information. Your son said my grandfather opened his eyes. Did he notice anything else? Any movement? Any detail? I'd have to ask him. Matthew's at home today, shaken by everything that happened. Claire bit her lip, thoughtful. I understand. Would it be possible for me to speak with him today, after my shift? Rebecca hesitated. Her protective instinct told her to keep Matthew away from all this, to let the matter fade naturally. But something in the young doctor's determined gaze made her reconsider. All right, I can give you our address, but I need to be present during the conversation. Of course, that's ideal, Claire agreed. And, Rebecca, please don't mention this to anyone, especially not Dr. Paul or any member of my family. Claire's cryptic request left Rebecca uneasy for the rest of the day. What inconsistencies could there be in Professor Williams' records? And why all the secrecy? At lunch, Rebecca got a text from the neighbor watching Matthew. He has a fever, 101.3 degree F. Gave him fever reducer as you instructed. Now her worry shifted. Had the emotional stress affected the boy's health? As soon as her shift ended, Rebecca rushed home to find Matthew lying on the living room couch, watching cartoons with glazed eyes. His usually rosy face was pale, except for fever-flushed cheeks. Hey, champ, how are you feeling? She asked, kneeling beside the couch and touching his hot forehead. Tired, he replied weakly, and my head hurts. Has the fever gone down at all? I think so. Mrs. Carmen gave me medicine and made soup, but I couldn't eat much. Rebecca smiled gratefully at the elderly neighbor, who was getting ready to leave. Thank you for taking care of him, Mrs. Carmen. I don't know what I'd do without you. No need to thank me, dear. That boy is such a sweetheart. Quiet and polite. He just got a little restless in his sleep, saying things I didn't understand. Must be the fever. After the neighbor left, Rebecca prepared some honey tea for Matthew and sat beside him. Son, I need to tell you something. Professor Williams' granddaughter, Dr. Claire, wants to talk to you about what you saw yesterday. Matthew perked up instantly, sitting up on the couch. She believes me? I'm not sure, sweetheart. She's a doctor and she's looking into some things about her grandfather's passing. She's coming over later. Matthew nodded, a new energy seeming to rise in him despite the fever. Mom, I dreamed about him today. About Professor William. In the dream, he was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. It was like he was trapped somewhere and needed help. Rebecca swallowed hard, torn between wanting to dismiss her son's feverish imaginings and a strange unease at the coincidence of his dream and Claire's concerns. It was just a dream, sweetheart. Rest a bit until Dr. Claire gets here, okay? Matthew lay back down, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling as if trying to decipher some invisible puzzle. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Around 7 in the evening, the doorbell rang. Claire Harrison stood at the doorstep, holding a folder and looking both professional and nervous. Thank you for having me, Rebecca, she said, stepping into the modest home. Her eyes quickly scanned the room in that way only doctors do, always alert for signs of health or illness. Matthew's in his room. He had a fever earlier, but he's better now. Still, I'd appreciate it if you kept it brief. Claire nodded understandingly. I promise not to tire him. I just need a few details that might be important. Rebecca led the doctor to Matthew's small room, decorated with posters of planets and a few modest chess tournament trophies from school. A hobby Rebecca now realized was likely influenced by Professor William. Matthew was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows with a chessboard beside him. When he saw Claire, his eyes lit up with recognition. You're his granddaughter. I've seen you at the hospital a few times, but we never talked. Claire smiled, surprised. Yes, that's me. You've got a good memory, Matthew. Professor William talked about you too, the boy continued, excited despite his weakness. He said you were as smart as him but braver, that you weren't afraid to face the big bears, whatever that means. Claire seemed momentarily thrown, as if those words held special meaning for her. Quickly regaining her composure, she pulled up a chair and sat by the bed. Matthew, I want you to tell me exactly what you saw yesterday at my grandfather's funeral. Every detail, no matter how small." The boy glanced uncertainly at Rebecca, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath and began. "I was with my mom at the service. Everyone was really sad. There were a lot of people I didn't know. When it was time to see Professor William one last time, everyone started passing by the casket. My mom held my hand. I didn't want to look because I didn't want to remember him like that, you know?" Claire nodded, urging him to go on. "But when we got close, I gathered my courage and looked, and that's when it happened. At first he looked like everyone says people do when they're gone. But then when I was really close, his eyes opened. Not all the way, just a little. It's like when you're really sleepy but trying to stay awake. And he looked at me, I'm sure of it, just for a second, but he recognized me. I know he did." "And then?" asked Claire, her professional voice barely masking the tension. "Then his eyes closed again. I got so scared I screamed for my mom. Everyone got mad at me. They thought I was making things up." Claire exchanged a meaningful glance with Rebecca. "Matthew, from what I understand, you and my grandfather talked a lot. Did he ever mention any specific health problems? Anything about fainting, unconscious states, rare conditions?" The boy thought for a moment, his forehead furrowed in concentration. "He told me once about when he was young. Said he had an episode where everyone thought he had passed, but he hadn't. Said he was trapped inside himself, unable to move or speak, but hearing everything around him. Said it was the worst experience of his life." Claire visibly paled. "Did he use any specific word to describe that condition?" Matthew shook his head. "I don't remember, it was a hard word. But he said it ran in the family, that his father had it once too." Claire stood abruptly, turning to the window to hide, her troubled expression. Rebecca watched the scene with growing apprehension. "Dr. Claire? What's going on?" The doctor turned slowly, her face now a mask of professional determination. "I believe my grandfather may have suffered from an extremely rare condition called catalepsy. It's a neurological disorder that causes muscle rigidity and an apparent lack of response to external stimuli, to the point where the person seems lifeless. In the most severe cases, even experienced professionals might mistake it for actual death." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. "Are you suggesting Professor William could be alive? It's a possibility I can't dismiss. Not with the family history Matthew just confirmed and the inconsistencies I found in the documentation." Matthew leaned forward, his eyes wide. "So I was right. He really did open his eyes." "It could have been a brief moment of awareness," Claire agreed. "Cataleptic states can fluctuate in intensity. The problem is, without proper documentation of this condition in his medical history and no prior knowledge from the attending doctors, it would be nearly impossible to identify." "What do we do now?" asked Rebecca, her nurse's mind already processing the medical, ethical, and legal implications of the situation. Claire ran a hand through her hair, clearly distressed. "My grandfather was buried this morning. If there's any chance, no matter how small, we need an exhumation," Rebecca finished. "Exactly. But for that, we'd need a court order. And to get one, I'd need more concrete evidence than the testimony of a 10-year-old boy, and my suspicions based on paperwork inconsistencies. My uncle won't authorize it willingly, I'm sure. He was already impatient to wrap up the whole funeral process." Matthew, who had been following the conversation with feverish attention, suddenly brightened. "The notebook!" he exclaimed. "Professor William had a notebook where he wrote everything down. He showed me once. It had notes about his episodes, like he called them. Said he kept it hidden because he didn't want to worry the family." Claire turned to the boy, suddenly alert. "Do you know where that notebook is?" "In his house's library, behind the Shakespeare books. He showed me the hiding spot because he said I was the only one interested in his old stories." Claire and Rebecca exchanged glances. If this notebook existed and contained detailed records of Professor E. William's previous cataleptic episodes, it could be the evidence they needed to request a deeper investigation. "We need to find that notebook," Claire decided. "But it won't be easy. The house is locked and my uncle is the only one with the keys now." "What if—" Rebecca began hesitantly. "What if we said Matthew left something valuable there?" something from his visits to the professor. It could be an excuse to go in and search. Claire considered the idea. It might work, but my uncle has been suspicious since the incident at the funeral. He may not allow it. What if we went straight to your grandmother? Rebecca suggested. Mrs. Helen might be more willing to listen, especially if she knows about the friendship between Matthew and her husband. The three of them fell silent. For a moment, weighing the possibilities. It was Matthew who finally spoke, his voice surprisingly steady for a sick child. We have to try. For the coolest person I ever knew. Claire smiled, touched by the boy's determination. You're right, Matthew. Tomorrow, I'll talk to my grandmother. Rebecca, could you and Matthew come with me? I think it's important she hears directly from him. If his fever stays gone, yes, Rebecca agreed, professionally cautious. After Claire left, promising to return the next day, Rebecca gave Matthew his nighttime medication and sat beside him on the bed. Mom, do you believe me now? He asked sleepily. Rebecca stroked his hair, a lump in her throat. I believe you, sweetheart, and I'm sorry I didn't believe you before. It's okay, he murmured, already drifting off. Professor William used to say people only believe what they're ready to see. As she watched her son fall asleep, Rebecca felt a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt for not noticing the meaningful friendship that had formed, fear of the professional consequences that might come from getting involved in this situation, and above all, a growing, terrible suspicion that something truly tragic might have happened. If Professor William really had suffered from catalepsy, if he had truly been declared dead too soon, the implications were too horrifying to contemplate. The next morning, to Rebecca's relief, Matthew woke up fever-free and with his appetite back. The plan was to meet Claire around 10 o'clock to go together to Mrs. Helen's house. How are we going to explain our visit? Rebecca asked as she helped Matthew get dressed. After what happened at the funeral, I doubt we'll be welcomed. I'll tell the truth, the boy replied simply. That Professor William was my friend and I wanted to tell Mrs. Helen about our chess games. Rebecca looked at her son with a mix of pride and worry. How could a 10-year-old sometimes be more direct and brave than most adults? At 10 sharp, Claire knocked on their door. She was visibly nervous. I managed to talk to my grandmother on the phone. She agreed to see us, but I didn't mention the real reason. I just said Matthew wanted to share some memories of Grandpa. The three of them walked together toward the Harrison house, located in one of the town's oldest neighborhoods. It was a traditional two-story home with a wide porch and a well-kept garden, though now showing slight signs of neglect, likely due to recent events. Mrs. Helen greeted them on the porch. She was an elegant woman, her white hair perfectly styled, her eyes revealing both dignity and recent grief. "Good morning, Claire, dear," she said, kissing her granddaughter's cheek. Then she turned her gaze to Rebecca and Matthew, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "And you must be Nurse Rebecca and your son." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Helen," replied Rebecca nervously. "Thank you for having us, especially after what happened." The older woman waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that. Children have vivid imaginations, I understand. William was a teacher. He loved the spontaneity of young people." She bent down slightly to look Matthew in the eyes. "So you knew my husband?" Matthew nodded, suddenly seeming shy. "Yes, ma'am. He taught me how to play chess." A shadow of confusion crossed the elderly woman's face. Chess? William hadn't played chess in years. His hands, with the arthritis, he didn't use the big pieces, Matthew quickly explained. "We used the small travel set with magnetic pieces. That way he didn't have to grip them hard." Mrs. Helen blinked, surprised by the specific detail. William did have a set like that. It belonged to his father. Her voice faltered for a moment. "Please, come inside. We can talk more comfortably there." The interior of the house was like a small museum filled with books, antiques, and family photographs. The curtains were half drawn, giving the space a solemn atmosphere, fitting for a house in mourning. "Richard went out to handle some estate matters," Mrs. Helen explained as she guided them to the living room. "And Megan, my daughter-in-law, took the grandchildren for a walk. I thought they could use some fresh air after everything." They settled onto the antique sofas in the living room, Claire gave Rebecca a meaningful look, and Rebecca nodded slightly. It was time to address the real reason for their visit. "Grandma," Claire began carefully, "there's something important we need to discuss about Grandpa and his medical condition." Mrs. Helen visibly stiffened. "Medical condition? Your grandfather had heart problems, Claire. You know that. That's what took him—" "It's not about his heart, Grandma. It's about something Grandpa may have kept from all of us. Something called catalepsy." The color drained from the older woman's face. Where did you hear about that?" Claire leaned forward, surprised by her grandmother's reaction. "So you knew?" Mrs. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "It only happened twice in his life. The first time when he was very young, before we even met. The second, right after your father was born. The doctors could never diagnose it properly. They called them prolonged fainting spells back then." "And why was that never included in his medical records?" Claire asked, an unintended accusatory tone in her voice. "Your grandfather didn't want it there," the older woman replied simply. "He said it was embarrassing that people would treat him as fragile or sick. You know how proud he was, Claire, and the episodes were so rare, decades apart." "Grandma, there's a chance that—" Claire hesitated, searching for the gentlest words possible. "That Grandpa may have had another cataleptic episode in the hospital, one that was mistaken for—" "No," Mrs. Helen interrupted, standing abruptly. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that." "Mrs. Helen," Rebecca interjected softly, "I know it's painful to consider, but if there's any possibility—" "My husband was examined by competent doctors. There was a death certificate, a wake, a burial." The older woman's voice trembled. "I won't let you disturb his rest based on a child's imagination and absurd theories." Matthew, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "Mrs. Helen, he told me about the notebook, the one he hid behind the Shakespeare books. He said it had everything about the episodes, as he called them." The woman staggered, bracing herself on the arm of a chair. "How could you know that?" Claire stood up, moving to support her grandmother. "Grandma, please, if that notebook exists, it could have crucial information. Details about his past episodes, symptoms, duration. We need to find it." Mrs. Helen looked at each of them for a long moment, as if weighing their intentions and trustworthiness. Finally, her shoulders slumped in resignation. "The library, third shelf, behind the bound collection of complete works." Claire and Rebecca exchanged relieved glances. The first obstacle had been overcome. Now they needed to find the notebook before Richard returned. The library was an impressive room, with floor-to-ceiling shelves covering 3 entire walls. Locating the Shakespeare section wasn't difficult, but removing the heavy bound volumes required the combined effort of Claire and Rebecca. "Here!" exclaimed Matthew, reaching into the empty space and pulling out a hardcover notebook, bound in leather worn from use. Claire took it with trembling hands and began flipping through it. The notebook contained meticulous notes, written in Professor William's elegant handwriting. Dates, symptoms, sensations, theories, a detailed diary of his mysterious condition. "My God," murmured Claire, reading quickly. "He researched this extensively. He made connections to similar cases in the family. His father, a great-uncle. He even corresponded with international specialists. Is there anything specific about the symptoms that precede the episodes?" asked Rebecca, her professional side taking over. Claire turned a few pages, focused. "Yes. He describes a progressive tingling sensation, starting in the extremities, extreme fatigue, mental confusion, and most significantly," she paused, paling, "a specific pattern of heart arrhythmia that could easily be mistaken for heart failure on a standard ECG. Exactly his final diagnosis," concluded Rebecca. A noise at the front of the house made all three freeze. The deep voice of Richard Harrison could be heard talking to his mother in the living room. "We need to get out of here," whispered Claire, closing the notebook and slipping it into her bag. "If my uncle finds us here with this—" Quickly, they replaced the Shakespeare books on the shelf and left the library. Too late. Richard Harrison was already in the hallway, staring at them with an expression of surprise that quickly turned to suspicion. "Claire, what are you doing here?" His eyes narrowed as he recognized Rebecca and Matthew. And what are these people doing in our house? Richard, I invited them, intervened Mrs. Helen, stepping closer to her son. The boy was friends with your father. He wanted to share some memories. Richard crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced. Memories? After the scene he caused at the funeral? He took a step toward Claire. You've always been stubborn, Claire, but this is ridiculous. What were you looking for in the library? Nothing, Uncle. I was just showing Matthew where Grandpa kept his favorite books. He was an avid reader, you know. Don't change the subject. Richard held out his hand. I want to see what you put in your bag. Now. Claire instinctively stepped back, gripping her bag tightly. Rebecca moved forward, placing herself between them. Mr. Harrison, I understand your suspicion, but I assure you we're not here to cause trouble. We just wanted... You have no right to be here, Richard interrupted, his voice rising. No right to disturb our family at a time like this. And you, Claire, should know better. Your grandfather was buried yesterday, for God's... Saki, that's exactly why we're concerned, Claire burst out, unable to hold back any longer. There's a real medical possibility that Grandpa wasn't dead when he was declared, and certainly not when he was buried. A deathly silence fell over the hallway. Mrs. Helen covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. How dare you, Richard murmured, his voice dangerously low. How dare you say something so cruel in front of your grandmother? It's not cruelty, Uncle. It's the truth. Grandpa suffered from catalepsy. It's all documented in this notebook. Claire took the object from her bag, holding it up as evidence. When he had that arrhythmia at the hospital, he was probably entering a cataleptic state, not dying. And if... Her voice faltered. And if he's still alive? Trapped in that coffin? Mrs. Helen let out a pained sob, leaning against the wall. Richard, on the other hand, seemed torn between anger and a sudden, unwelcome doubt. This is madness, he said, though with less conviction. Doctors certified his death. You yourself signed the final report, Claire. I signed it based on the information available, which was incomplete, she defended herself. No one knew about the catalepsy because Grandpa hid it from everyone. Uncle, we need to request an exhumation, immediately. Every minute counts if you... There's any chance. Richard ran a hand over his face, visibly shaken by the possibility, however remote. Do you have any idea what you're proposing? The additional trauma for your grandmother? For all of us? What if you're wrong? What if I'm right? Claire countered. We could be condemning Grandpa to a horrible fate because of our pride or fear of admitting a mistake. Matthew, who had been silently observing the discussion, suddenly spoke up. He didn't want people to know about his illness because he was afraid they'd treat him differently. But he told me because he said children don't judge. He said if it ever happened. Again, I should tell someone brave enough to believe. Everyone turned to the boy, struck by the maturity of his words. Mrs. Helen approached him, kneeling with difficulty to meet his height. Did you really see him open his eyes, my dear? Do you truly believe he was... conscious? Matthew nodded, solemnly. I'm sure, Mrs. Helen, he looked right at me, like he wanted to tell me something. The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, then stood with newfound resolve. Richard, I want you to help Claire. If there's even the slightest chance that William is... Mom, think about this, Richard pleaded. The emotional toll, the public exposure, the cost... I don't care about any of that, Mrs. Helen declared with surprising firmness. We're talking about the man I shared over 50 years of my life with. If there's a chance, no matter how small, that he's suffering, Richard seemed to wilt under his mother's determination. Turning to Claire, he asked, what do we need to do? A court order for immediate exhumation based on suspicion of medical error and an undiagnosed condition, Claire replied promptly. The notebook will be crucial as evidence, and we'll need a specialized medical team on standby in case... She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication, in case Professor William was truly alive. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Richard, now converted to the cause, used his connections as an influential businessman in town to expedite the legal process. Claire contacted colleagues from the capital who had experience with rare neurological cases. Rebecca offered her professional assistance and her testimony as a nurse. The on-duty judge, initially skeptical, was convinced after reading Professor William's notebook and quickly consulting a medical specialist. The exhumation order was issued as an emergency, a practically unprecedented occurrence in small Riverside Falls. At the town cemetery, as the sun set, a small team gathered. Cemetery workers, the requested medical team, the Harrison family, Rebecca and Matthew. The operation was conducted discreetly, though rumors had already begun to spread in the small town. The coffin was carefully removed and opened under medical supervision. The moment the coffin lid was lifted was one of absolute tension. Mrs. Helen sobbed, gripping her granddaughter's hand tightly. Richard looked like he was about to faint. Rebecca kept Matthew partially hidden behind her, unsure whether a child should witness such a scene. Claire, dressed in protective medical gear, was the first to approach along with the specialist doctor. Long seconds passed as they examined the motionless body of Professor William. It was the specialist who finally spoke, his voice muffled by the mask but clear enough. There are vital signs. Weak, almost imperceptible but present. A collective murmur of shock and horror swept through those present. Mrs. Helen fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, caught between relief and terror. Richard had to be supported by his wife, who had just arrived. The medical team sprang into action immediately, transferring Professor William to a stretcher and connecting him to monitoring equipment. The preliminary diagnosis confirmed a profound cataleptic state, a condition so rare that many of the doctors present had never witnessed it before. Matthew watched everything with wide eyes, clinging to his mother's hand. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked quietly. Rebecca didn't know how to answer. How could she explain the medical complexities and uncertainties of such an extraordinary situation to a child? "The doctors will do everything they can, sweetheart," she replied honestly. "We'll have to wait and see." Professor William was urgently transported to the capital city hospital, better equipped to handle his exceptional case. The news spread quickly, first through the town, then the region, and finally attracting national attention. "Man resurrects after being buried alive," screamed the sensationalist headlines, though doctors emphasized he had never truly been dead, only in a state that mimicked death almost perfectly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca and Matthew's lives were deeply affected by the events. From villains who had disrupted a funeral, they became local heroes, credited with saving the life of a man beloved by the community. Matthew in particular became something of a celebrity at school, though he himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't do anything special, Mom," he said one night over dinner. "I just said what I saw." "Sometimes, sweetheart, the bravest thing we can do is simply tell the truth, even when no one believes us," Rebecca replied, filled with pride for her son's character. Professor William's case sparked discussions in the medical community about death verification protocols, especially in rare and poorly documented conditions. The local hospital implemented new guidelines, and Dr. Paul, the clinical director, issued a formal apology to the Harrison family and Rebecca. As for Professor William himself, his recovery was slow and uncertain. After 2 weeks in a medically induced coma to protect his brain functions, he finally began showing signs of consciousness. First, small involuntary movements, then responses to simple stimuli. And finally, in the 4th week, he opened his eyes. Claire, who had divided her time between her duties at the local hospital and regular visits to her grandfather in the capital, was the first to notice. She had been reading aloud to him, a practice doctors encouraged even for unconscious patients, when she realized she was being watched. "Grandpa," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it, "can you hear me?" The old man's eyes, once so lively and expressive, now wandered unfocused around the room, but when Claire took his hand, she felt a faint squeeze in response. In the following days, the medical team conducted a series of neurological tests. The results were mixed. There was brain damage due to prolonged lack of proper oxygenation, but also promising signs of recovery in basic functions. "We need to be realistic about the prognosis," the chief neurologist explained to the gathered family. Cases like this are extremely rare, practically unheard of in modern medical literature. Professor William suffered significant physical trauma. We can't predict with certainty how much of his functions he'll recover or in what time frame. Mrs. Helen, who had practically moved to the capital to be near her husband, remained unwavering in her optimism. "I know my William," she said firmly. "He's a fighter, always has been. He'll come back to us." Richard, on the other hand, wavered between crushing guilt and cautious hope. The debts that had led him to rush his father's burial failed. Investments that threatened his business now seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of what had almost happened. He confessed everything to the family and sought legitimate financial help, determined to make amends. A month after Professor E. William's resurrection, as some insisted on calling it, Rebecca received a call from Claire. "Grandpa asked about Matthew," she said, her voice emotional. "He still can't speak clearly, but he wrote his name. Could you visit him this weekend?" Rebecca looked at Matthew, who was absently playing with the chessboard on the living room table. Since the traumatic events, he'd had occasional nightmares, but had also shown surprising maturity in handling everything. "Would you like to visit Professor William?" she asked. "He's getting better and asked about you." The boy's face lit up instantly. "Is he talking? Does he remember me?" "He's not speaking very well yet, but yes, he remembers." "Je suisven. Can we go tomorrow?" Matthew insisted eagerly. The hospital in the capital was very different from the small-town hospital where Rebecca worked. Bigger, more modern, with endless hallways and an air of clinical efficiency that was a little intimidating. Claire met them in the lobby and guided them to the neurological recovery wing. On the way, she updated Rebecca on her grandfather's condition. Physical therapy is helping with limb mobility. Speech is still the biggest challenge, but the speech therapist is optimistic. Cognitively she hesitated. There are good days and bad days. His long-term memory seems relatively intact, but he's confused about recent events. We still haven't told him all the details of what happened. Matthew, walking slightly ahead of them, seemed to absorb every word with solemn attention. When they finally entered the room, they found Professor William sitting in a special chair by the window. He was thinner, paler, with a fragility that starkly contrasted the imposing figure he once was. But his eyes, when they turned to the door, held a glimmer of recognition. Mrs. Helen, seated beside her husband, smiled when she saw them. "Look who came to visit you, dear." Matthew approached timidly, suddenly unsure. Professor William reached out a trembling hand toward him. When the boy took it, a tear rolled down the old man's wrinkled face. You saw," he struggled to say. Matthew nodded, his own eyes brimming. "You opened your eyes. I knew I wasn't imagining it." The professor gave a slight nod, squeezing the boy's hand. Thank you." The scene was so moving that all the adults present were touched. Rebecca, watching the special connection between her son and the elderly man, finally understood the depth of the bond that had formed between them during those afternoons at the hospital. Professor William motioned to Claire, who approached, with a communication board, a simple system where he could point to letters and common words to express himself when speech failed. Slowly, with patience, he formed a message. "Chess play." Matthew beamed. "I brought the travel set, the one with magnetic pieces you taught me to use." Under the emotional gaze of those present, the boy and the elderly man began a silent game. Professor William moved the pieces with difficulty, his motor coordination still impaired, but his eyes revealed a focus and clarity that surprised even the doctors who occasionally stopped by to check his condition. That visit was the first of many. In the months that followed, as Professor William fought to regain his abilities, Matthew became a constant presence in his rehabilitation. The doctors noticed how the patient seemed more motivated and responsive after the boy's visits and soon officially incorporated chess games as part of his cognitive therapy. Rebecca, in turn, developed a close friendship with Claire. The two women, initially brought together by the extraordinary situation they faced, discovered they had much in common: dedication to medicine, a commitment to their patients' well-being, and a determination that refused to back down from authorities or protocols when someone's life was at stake. 6 months after his resurrection, Professor William was discharged from the hospital. Though he still required constant care, and his recovery was far from complete, the doctors agreed he would benefit from being in a familiar environment. The town of Riverside Falls prepared a special welcome. The former educator, now also a symbol of resilience and hope, was greeted with banners, flowers, and a crowd of former students and friends. He observed it all from his wheelchair, sometimes confused by the commotion but visibly moved. That afternoon, sitting on the Harrisons' porch, Professor William, now able to form simple sentences with effort, called Matthew closer. "You saved my life," he said slowly. The boy shook his head. "You saved me first, Professor. You taught me to trust what I see even when others doubt." The old man smiled, a lopsided grin due to the partial paralysis still affecting one side of his face. "I always had trust in your eyes and on your heart." From a distance, Rebecca watched the interaction, reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past months. Her life had changed in so many ways. She'd received a promotion at the hospital, now leading an initiative to improve vital sign verification protocols. Matthew had grown more confident, overcoming his earlier shyness, and she herself had discovered an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. Claire approached, handing her a cup of coffee. "What are you thinking about?" "How life can change completely in an instant," Rebecca replied. "How one small moment of courage, one simple act of speaking the truth can set off something so transformative." Claire nodded, her gaze also fixed on the grandfather and the boy now arranging the chess pieces. "You know what amazes me most? How Grandpa, even in that state between life and death, somehow recognized Matthew, as if there were a special connection that transcended even that extreme condition. Perhaps there are more mysteries between consciousness and unconsciousness than our medicine can explain," Rebecca suggested. "No doubt, and that's exactly why we must always stay open to possibilities, to question diagnoses, to listen even to the most unlikely voices, like a boy's at a funeral." At that moment, as if sensing they were talking about him, Matthew looked in their direction and smiled, a pure, radiant smile that held all the innocent wisdom of childhood, the kind that sees simple truths adults, with their complex logic, sometimes fail to notice. A week later, Professor William surprised everyone by expressing his desire to return to the town school, not as an active teacher, of course, but as a volunteer for a new chess program being implemented. "My mind needs exercise," he explained to his worried family. "And I can help children." The school principal, a former student of Professor William, welcomed the idea with enthusiasm. Soon a small room was adapted to become Professor William's Chess Club, where students of all ages could learn the game under the patient, if sometimes halting, guidance of the experienced educator. Matthew naturally became his unofficial assistant, helping explain rules when the professor's words failed, setting up the boards and occasionally acting as a translator when the older man struggled to make himself understood. It was during one of these chess club sessions, nearly a year after the extraordinary events, that Professor William had a moment of startling clarity. "I heard everything," he said suddenly, as they waited for the other students to arrive. His speech, though still slow, had improved considerably with constant therapy. "In the hospital, at the funeral, in the coffin." Matthew stopped arranging the pieces, staring at his mentor with wide eyes. "You remember?" The professor nodded gravely. "Fragments, like a bad dream, distant voices, darkness. Then, your eyes. I saw you looking at me. I tried, with all my strength, to give a sign. And you did," Matthew confirmed. "I saw it. Many didn't believe you." The old man paused, searching for the right words. "But you persisted, brave." "I was scared a lot," the boy confessed, "but I remembered what you taught me about chess. Sometimes we have to sacrifice a piece to save the game." Professor William smiled. "You sacrificed your reputation to save my life." Matthew shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," the professor contradicted, serious. "Many would see and ignore or doubt what they saw. The world is full of people who deny the truth for convenience." Just then, the first students began arriving, cutting short their deep conversation. But Professor William motioned for Matthew to come closer and whispered, "One day, I'll write our story, so everyone knows the importance of trusting their own eyes." And indeed, in the years that followed, as his speech and motor skills improved, Professor William dedicated himself to recording his extraordinary experience. What began as therapeutic notes to aid his cognitive recovery evolved into a full manuscript, detailing not only the medical aspects of his rare condition, but also his profound reflections on life, death, and the limbo between them that he had endured. The book, when finally published, caused a sensation in the medical community and among the general public. Between Worlds, A Journey from Catalepsy to Consciousness, became an important case study for neurologists and an inspiring testament for patients with complex neurological conditions. But for the people of Riverside Falls, especially for Matthew and Rebecca, the real story wasn't in the pages of the book, but in the transformation they witnessed in their own lives. Rebecca, inspired by the experience, decided to specialize in neurological nursing, eventually securing a position at the same capital city hospital where Professor William had received treatment. Her practical knowledge, combined with her sensitivity in listening to patients and their families, made her an exceptionally respected professional. Claire Harrison, in turn, became a fierce advocate for improved death diagnosis protocols, publishing scientific articles on rare conditions that could be mistaken for death. Her pioneering work led to the implementation of new guidelines in hospitals across the country. As for Matthew, the shy boy who had once been mocked for making up stories, found his true passions in chess and science. Inspired by Professor William and Claire, he decided he also wanted to be a doctor one day, a doctor who would always listen to his patients, even when what they said seemed unlikely. On a sunny afternoon, 5 years after that fateful day at the funeral, Matthew, now a teenager about to start high school, visited Professor William for one of their regular chess matches. The elderly man, though still using a cane and occasionally struggling to find the right words, had regained much of his independence and clarity. "Checkmate in 3 moves," Matthew announced with a shy smile. The professor examined the board for a long moment, then laughed. "You've finally outplayed me," he admitted with genuine pride. "The student has surpassed the master." Matthew shook his head. "I'll never surpass you, Professor, not in what truly matters." "And what would that be?" the old man asked, curious. "Courage, determination, the wisdom to recognize what's true even when everyone says it's impossible." Professor William smiled, deeply moved. "Now you know," he said, his voice firmer than usual, "there's a lesson in chess that fits our story perfectly." "What is it?" "Sometimes the smallest piece, the pawn, the one many underestimate." He paused, pointing to one of the white pieces on the board, is exactly the one that changes the course of the entire game, especially when it moves forward fearlessly, even against all odds. Matthew nodded, understanding the analogy. "Like a boy at a funeral?" "Exactly." The professor adjusted his glasses, looking directly into the young man's eyes. "Never underestimate the power of a single act of courage, Matthew. That's how you changed the game of my life. That's how you brought me back from the darkness." Across the room, Rebecca watched the interaction, her heart overflowing with pride. Her son, that little boy who had once been called a liar and a dreamer, had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that truth, even when unlikely, deserves to be defended. And that sometimes it's precisely in the most improbable situations that we find our true strength. "What are masters for?" Matthew teased, "if not to teach us to see beyond the obvious?" "And what are students for?" the professor replied, with a smile. "If not to remind us we always have more to learn?" Outside, the sun began to set over Riverside Falls, casting a golden light through the window. Professor and student set up the pieces for a new game, each move a quiet celebration of life, friendship, and the extraordinary journeys that sometimes begin with a single glance, a glance that against all odds is seen by exactly the right person. As night gently fell over the small Pennsylvania town, the words "Mom," he opened his eyes, once a source of embarrassment and doubt, now echoed as a testament to the power of a child's perception and persistence in the face of disbelief. A simple phrase that had changed not just one life, but an entire community, forever. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us tremendously as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 years later, the story of Professor William and Matthew had inspired significant changes in the regional healthcare system. Riverside Falls Community Hospital, once a modest and sometimes outdated institution, had become a reference center for diagnosing rare neurological conditions, thanks to Claire's tireless efforts and the financial support of Richard, who, redeemed by the near-tragic episode, had dedicated a considerable portion of his resources to the cause. This extraordinary story had captured the attention of specialists across the country. A new death verification protocol, informally nicknamed the Harrison Protocol by healthcare professionals, had become standard in several hospitals. The case was regularly featured at medical conferences as a powerful reminder of the dangers of hasty diagnoses and the importance of listening to all voices, even those that seem less credible. For Rebecca, now head nurse of the neurology wing at the regional hospital, each day brought new challenges and satisfactions. Her unique experience had made her particularly attuned to patients with altered states of consciousness. Families of coma or vegetative state patients often sought her guidance, drawn to her combination of technical knowledge and empathy. Matthew, now 18, was preparing to enter medical school, determined to follow in Claire's footsteps and inspired by Professor William's extraordinary recovery. He had grown into an observant and insightful young man, carrying with him the invaluable lesson he'd learned as a child, the importance of trusting his own senses and intuition, even in the face of doubt from others. One Sunday afternoon, while helping Professor William organize his vast library, a therapeutic task the elderly man adored, Matthew came across an old photo album. "What's this, Professor?" he asked, carefully opening the worn leather cover. The old man adjusted his glasses, leaning in for a better look. "Ah," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with recognition. "My classroom memories album. 40 years of teaching." His voice, now steadier after years of intensive therapy, still carried the melodic tone of a born educator. Together, they flipped through the yellowed pages, silent witnesses to decades dedicated to education, graduating classes, school festivals, science competitions. The story of a life of devotion carefully documented. "Look at this one," the professor said, pointing to a faded photograph of a small group of children gathered around a chessboard. "My first chess club, back in 1975. No one believed it would work in a rural school, but these boys..." He smiled, lost in memories. "Thrice they made it to the state finals." Matthew studied the photograph with interest. There was something about the determined expressions of those children that resonated deeply with him. "You always saw potential where others didn't. Are you?" The professor nodded thoughtfully. "True education, Matthew, isn't about memorizing facts or equations. It's about learning to observe, to question, to think for yourself." He paused, his gaze growing distant. "During those months, when I was trapped inside myself, unable to communicate, the most torturous thing was hearing the doctors discussing my case as if I were just a set of symptoms, not a conscious person." Matthew swallowed hard, imagining the horror of that experience. "How did you keep from going mad?" "By focusing on the present, on every breath, every heartbeat, and holding on to the hope that someone at some point would notice I was still there." He smiled, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "And then you showed up with your watchful eyes and unshakable conviction." "I still have nightmares sometimes," Matthew confessed quietly. "I dream I'm screaming that you're alive, but no one can hear me." Professor Williams squeezed his shoulder gently. "Trauma leaves its mark even in happy endings, but it also changes us. You wouldn't be the young man you are today without that experience." Matthew nodded, acknowledging the truth in those words. "You know what scares me the most?" he continued, thinking about how many people throughout history might have gone through something similar, but weren't lucky enough to have someone notice, to insist, to fight for them. The comment lingered between them, heavy with unsettling implications. For a moment, both silently contemplated the countless invisible tragedies human history might hold. It was the professor who finally broke the thoughtful silence. That's why your path in medicine is so important, Matthew. You carry that awareness, that special sensitivity. He turned another page in the album, revealing more recent photographs. Look, here's the new chess club. The first one after my return. The photo showed the professor in his wheelchair, which he rarely used now, surrounded by a diverse group of children, including a younger Matthew, clearly proud in his role as an assistant. I remember that day, Matthew smiled. That's when Julian beat Richard, and he got so mad he knocked over the board. And you made him apologize and set up every piece exactly as it was, the professor added, laughing. You already had a knack for conflict resolution. Mrs. Helen entered the library with a tray of coffee and cookies. You two have been in here for hours. What are you talking about so intently? We're revisiting history, dear, the professor replied, looking affectionately at his wife. She set the tray on a side table and leaned in to see the album. Oh, the old photographs. Her face softened with nostalgia. So many memories. We were just talking about how small actions can completely change the course of a life, Matthew explained. Mrs. Helen nodded, her eyes meeting her husband's in a meaningful glance. Or save one, she added softly. A comfortable silence settled over the three of them as the afternoon sun filtered through the library windows, illuminating the photo album and the three generations bound by an extraordinary chain of events. So you know what I recently found out? The professor remarked after a few sips of coffee. That my case is being studied in medical schools as an example of differential diagnosis in neurology. Really? Matthew perked up. I might end up studying about you in class. I can picture it now, the professor joked. Professor, I know this case personally. In fact, I was the one who discovered the patient was alive. The three of them laughed, finding lightness even in the memories of those dramatic moments. Claire told me she's writing a scientific paper about your case, Matthew mentioned. She wants to document the entire recovery process, especially the unconventional methods we used. Like therapeutic chess? Mrs. Helen asked. Exactly. And how involving children in an elderly person's rehabilitation played a role. She says the intergenerational connection might have been a crucial factor in the professor's exceptional recovery. The older man smiled, visibly proud of his granddaughter. Claire's always had a brilliant mind. I remember her as a little girl taking clocks apart just to understand how they worked. He paused thoughtfully. It's funny how life connects us, isn't it? I, an old professor on the brink of the impossible. Claire with her medical knowledge and courage to question authority. You, Matthew, with your sharp perception and determination. Each piece necessary on the chessboard, exactly at the right moment. Matthew nodded, appreciating the chess analogy. An unlikely combination, but perfect. And your mother, added Mrs. Helen. We can't forget Rebecca. Her support was crucial, believing in you when it would have been much easier to dismiss what you saw as a child's imagination. My mother always taught me to stand up for what I believe in, Matthew said proudly, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. As they continued flipping through the album, reminiscing and reflecting on the extraordinary twists of fate, the phone rang. Mrs. Helen answered and, after a brief conversation, returned with a radiant smile. That was Dr. Patricia from the State University. They want William to give a lecture at the next conference on consciousness and altered states. Imagine that, from patient to guest speaker. The professor seemed momentarily surprised, then smiled. I suppose I have a story or two to tell. Will you accept? Matthew asked. On one condition, that you join me as co-presenter. Me? The young man nearly choked on his cookie. But what could I possibly add? The most important perspective of all, the professor replied seriously. That of someone who sees what others cannot. Someone who has the courage to trust their own eyes, even when the whole world says they're wrong. Matthew felt the weight of those words and the responsibility they carried. His experience, as personal and unique as it was, now had the potential to inform and perhaps even reshape medical practices that could affect countless lives. In that case, he finally replied, it would be an honor. That night, as he walked home under the starry sky of Riverside Falls, Matthew reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few years. From a shy, often invisible boy, he had become part of a story that literally changed and saved lives. His mother was waiting on the porch, as she always did when he visited the professor late. Rebecca, though still young, showed the first silver threads in her dark hair, marks of a life lived intensely and the responsibilities she carried with grace and determination. "How was the visit?" she asked, as her son joined her on the old rocking chair they shared on nights like these. "Inspiring as always," he replied, gazing at the night sky. "Mom, do you think I made the right choice? Medicine?" Rebecca studied her son's face, now with more defined adult features, but still carrying that spark of sensitivity and perception that had always defined him. "The question is, do you think you did?" Matthew pondered for a moment. "Yes. I think there are people out there, maybe in states we don't fully understand, maybe struggling to truly be seen, who need doctors who see beyond the obvious." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Then that's exactly where you should be." The professor was invited to give a lecture at the state university about his experience. He wants me to go with him as co-presenter. "How wonderful," Rebecca exclaimed, genuinely happy. "The two of you side by side sharing that extraordinary story." "It's terrifying," Matthew admitted, speaking to an audience of experts, professors, medical students, more terrifying than shouting at a funeral that a deceased person opened their eyes. Rebecca teased gently. Matthew laughed. "When you put it that way." They sat in silence for a moment, gently rocking in their chairs, gazing at the small town that had been the stage for one of the most extraordinary chapters of their lives. "You know what Professor Williams said today?" Matthew finally remarked. "That sometimes the smallest piece on the board is the very one that changes the whole game." Rebecca nodded, understanding the depth of that observation. "He's right. And that's why we should never underestimate the power of a single voice, of a single attentive glance, of a single moment of courage." Matthew leaned back against his mother's shoulder, as he used to do when he was younger. Though he was now nearly her height, in that moment he allowed himself to be the boy who, years ago, had the insight and courage that changed so many lives. "Thank you, Mum," he said softly. "For what?" "For raising me to believe that what I see matters, that my voice deserves to be heard, that the truth is worth fighting for, even when it seems unlikely." Rebecca kissed the top of her son's head, her heart overflowing with emotion. In the stars above them, in the soft lights of the town around them, in the comfortable silence, between mother and son, there was a shared certainty that the greatest miracles often begin with the simplest words, spoken at just the right moment. And for Rebecca and Matthew, those words would forever be, "Mum." He opened his eyes. End of story. Did you feel the emotion of seeing Professor William reclaim his life thanks to Matthew's special insight? Tell us what you thought of the story and which moment touched your heart the most. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more moving stories that make us reflect on the power of courage.